Chapter 5 is what I call a three musketeers clause, all for one and one for all. But if you're going to say all for one and only one and a half for all, or one and a half or three against, you've got a problem. I'd like to go into this further, if I may, because it's quite clear that Trump, I suspect it's Rubio, and I don't think it's Hegseth. And it may just about be J.D. Vance, but we've got to get to the thinkers behind them, and I suspect it's Elbridge Colby, the Deputy Defence Secretary, is saying, oi, 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 yeah, we support NATO, bloody, bloody, blah, and we'll give you a certain amount of int and info and overflight, exactly as it happened in Operation Elemi in 2011 in Libya, but boots on the ground along the border. It wouldn't be in Ukraine, but would be around Ukraine, and it would be very much a reinforcement in the Baltics and in Poland and possibly Finland.
Hello and welcome to the Trump Report for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. At this time we're joined by defence editor at The Standard and contributor to the iPaper and The Observer, and very much a friend of the show, Robert Fox. Robert, nice to speak to you again.
Hello. Hello.
Well, talks have continued into today between Trump and European leaders and partners, including, of course, President Zelensky. What do you make of what we're seeing?
Can we go back to Alaska at the weekend through to the events, a big circus at the White House 24 hours ago, more show than substance, I'm afraid. And Louis, what I'd like to say is there is both more to this and less to this than meets the eye. I sound like some pompous old art connoisseur in the 18th century, which I suppose at heart I really am. Less to it than meets the eye is there has been no agreement. And the party that really has to agree is Moscow, Kremlin, and Putin. And Putin is showing no sign at all that he wants to stop the war. Ceasefire, comprehensive peace plan, you name it, not a sign of response from him. More to it than meets the eye is it is clear, shock and awe, the Putin party in Alaska shocked the Trump party. Because something happened, and something that has yet to be explained, in that there was cheery greetings, travelling in the same car, starting up, and then suddenly half the meeting is cut, including the well-prepared situation for business interests to meet, namely led by Steve Witkoff, who seems to be more interested in business than anything else, and his opposite number, Kirill Dmitriev, who has the unwieldy title of being in charge of Russian government, international investment policy, and you name whatever we can get away with under the table. But they were all lined up, and there were a lot of very hard advisors of Vladimir Putin there, including Mr. Ushakov, unspecified, close confidant, policy advisor to the Security Council. By that I mean the core Security Council in the Kremlin, and the leader himself. And the dead giveaway was the peremptory way in which it was finished. Very short statement by Trump's usually rambling standards, very brief from Putin, but he was the cat that had got the cream because he had got exactly what he wanted. And he wanted to be seen there as Trump's equal, prancing around on the global stage out of isolation.
Something has happened then at that meeting. Do you think we're perhaps starting to see yet another great reset with Russia failing?
Yes, because this is where I think Vladimir Putin is really showing his experience, that he's been at this game in his rise to power. I'm talking about even before he became leader, 1990s, working through the hierarchy in the Petersburg municipality, where he had all kinds of friends and allies, now not so much friends and allies, and some of them dead, like Yevgeny Prigozhin. He knows what he wants. And I think that we should have been warned at the beginning of the Alaska meetings when rather unwisely, I thought, but he was tremendously confident that Mr. Lavrov, the foreign minister, extremely experienced by that, can I say, he's up there with Andrei Gromyko, if anybody can remember, who was one of the longest lasting Soviet foreign ministers, and he's going for the marathon because Lavrov has been there, and he was wearing a baseball sweatshirt with CCCP. That is the Communist Party of Soviet Russia. If ever that was waving two fingers in your face, was that. And he said, our terms have not changed. And they are, we want end of encirclement of Russia. We want regime change with elections, so-called, in Kiev. We want guaranteed neutrality. That means really largely disarm Ukraine, and no ambition declared, recognized, or promises otherwise offered, as have been before, promissory notes which can't be redeemed, that Ukraine will join NATO, that Ukraine will never join NATO, which shows how much they understand about NATO. You can elect to join NATO, you can choose to join NATO, and you cannot bind future governments into not joining NATO. And that is a warning as much to Trump as it is to Putin. I think we're coming to a flex point, a real crisis point, one of the really biggest crisis points in the history of the alliance, which has been going on since 48-49 with the Washington Treaty of NATO. And it's up there with the Cuban Missile Crisis, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, where there was an excess of triumphalism, and also NATO allowing its forces and resources to be deployed out of area. First of all, just about in the area to former Yugoslavia, and then in support of the Afghan stabilization force, which was really a framework by NATO, though not declared in name to be a NATO operation. Can I just add that we ought to remind ourselves that NATO is a declared defensive alliance. What we might be getting into, if things go very silly, that it may become into a limited offensive alliance to protect its members, and particularly its newer members, Sweden and above all Finland, on its eastern border.
So where does all of this leave Trump? Because I think there's no reason, I would say at this point, to believe that Trump is willing to put tighten the screws on Putin and the Kremlin. What are his options now then?
The result is simply that, Louis, you've got it right. Despite the talk and the blather about really, the guy doesn't want peace, doubling down with secondary sanctions, making very rude noises and upsetting the Indians very much. But India is very, very much in the game, because one of the stories that hasn't been covered copiously, which might have been, is the ghost fleet tankers off Ireland. Big tankers, rust buckets, some of them, particularly the inappropriately named Blue, which has been trans-decking or cross-decking, as it's called, large amounts, up to 100,000 tons of Russian crude into other ships to go off to all sorts of ports, heaven knows where, but mostly India and China, largely under British dependency territory flags. We haven't heard a lot about that. We've had a warning from the Irish Coast Guard Service, and the Irish Coast Guard Service has only one patrol vessel to deal with it, and the Brits haven't got anybody to spare from the OPVs, offshore patrol vessels, that we've got in the Channel dealing with migrants and ghost ships there. I think the resource-poor NATO is very much a story of the moment. And I have to say, wish as the father of the thought, I hope to be writing about this extensively at the weekend.
And so, moving on to the meetings we've seen between Trump and the European leaders, then, how do you judge those? Does it at least look better than that meeting that Putin had with Trump before the weekend?
It looks better, but it's a terrible bear trap, because it's absolutely clear that if you're going to do the lifting on the ground, and he is very clear about this, American troops on the ground are not going to be involved. And then we have to come to the sort of the mangled language of Steve Witkoff on two counts. One, it is absolutely not clear what he discussed with Putin before Putin decided he could go for a meeting in Alaska. He was thoroughly confused when he appeared on television just before that. What had he said that Trump was prepared to persuade Zelensky to give up? Was it just the Donbass areas and the concentration, and particularly thereafter Donetsk at the moment, because they haven't got complete control? By that I mean the Russian forces of Donetsk. They have Luhansk, but he gave away Zaporizhia and Kherson as well, and a lot more, and the possibility of elections. And he seemed thoroughly and utterly confused. Now that's one area of confusion, and he'd obviously been doing a business deal with Dmitriev and Narishkin and others, in saying that we will do the minerals. I will find a way of getting American investment back into Russian hydrocarbons. He seemed hardly interested, by the way, or hardly focused on Ukraine itself. And therein comes the second fog of rhetoric problem with Mr. Witkoff. He started this business of saying we could offer a security guarantee to a peace agreement, negotiated peace agreement, very short negotiation, but a peace agreement rather than a ceasefire with Ukraine and Russia, where there would be a NATO Chapter 5 arrangement for the allies to support Ukraine. That is absolutely an internal contradiction that Lewis Carroll's Humpty Dumpty in Through the Looking Glass would admire, would really crack his outer shell over. It is just a complete nonsense, because Chapter 5 is designated to be a defensive mechanism. In my experience, it's been invoked 2 or 3 times, one very mildly when they thought it was going to be a space attack. But it's very interesting to look at the specificities of the two. One is 9/11, and the other is the Iraqi incursion, possibly over the border near Erbil and round there in 91, when the Kurds were driven north into southern Turkey, and the Turks, they full NATO allies, said, that if it developed into a full-scale invasion, are you going to come and rescue? And then, interestingly, Mitterrand and Kohl, above all, John Major, did act very adroitly. That's just a piece of history, but it's how the mechanism works. And what worries me, that it seemed to me that Witkoff hadn't a clue how it worked. Because supposing you have an invocation of Chapter 5, and it's entirely possible that, say, you take something like the Suwalki corridor running between Lithuania and Poland, going up to Kaliningrad, and there's some encroachment on Polish territory there. Poland could say, look, this is for real, it's a developing offensive. What about Chapter 5? What happens then? It can't be the Supreme Allied Commander or the main backer, America, that decides yay or nay. They may decide nay, but they can't unilaterally decide yay. It has to go to the North Atlantic Council. It's very boring, I know, to go through all this, but it has a democratic mechanism. And if that goes to a democratic vote in a forum, then you have Humph, you have Erdogan, and you have Mr. Orban, and you have the president of Slovakia saying, no, this isn't what we wanted, it isn't what it's about. And Chapter 5 is what I call a 3 musketeers clause, all for one and one for all. But if you're going to say all for one and only 1.5 for all, or 1.5 or 3 against, you've got a problem. I'd like to go into this further, if I may, because it's quite clear that Trump, I suspect it's Rubio, and I don't think it's Hegseth. It may just about be J.D. Vance, but we've got to get to the thinkers behind them, and I suspect it's Elbridge Colby, the Deputy Defence Secretary, is saying, oi, 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 yeah, we support NATO, bloody, bloody, blah, and we'll give you a certain amount of int and info and overflight, exactly as it happened in Operation Elemi in 2011 in Libya, but boots on the ground along the border. It wouldn't be in Ukraine, but would be around Ukraine, and it would be very much a reinforcement in the Baltics and in Poland and possibly Finland. And this is where I think Starmer, above all, has walked into a trap, because he will be asked to be among the leaders of it. We have a bereft army at the moment. We have quite a high defense budget, but we have an under-equipped navy, a dysfunctionally equipped air force, and the management isn't terribly good. And we've had a wonderful piece of magic realism in the Strategic Defence Review saying, jam tomorrow, maybe if you're lucky, and maybe never, never. Nothing is really going to be spent on absolutely critical areas of UK defence and security for another 2 or 3 years in the way that the Labour government has stacked it up. Because Rachel Reeves, going through the accounts, and they call the accounts, saying, we do annualisation and you've blown your budget, defence, for next year and the year after. So we're only talking about a possible uplift towards the end of 2027. Now, how are you going to lead an operation like that? Because as our allies are saying, you've got to be effective. We've been sending units into Estonia as part of the reassuring force, like the borrowers, borrowing ammunition, borrowing guns, borrowing this, that, the other. So it is a moment of truth.
So is Europe overpromising there, or for that matter, is Trump overpromising what Europe can provide? I mean, are European boots on the ground in Ukraine in some capacity? I don't think anyone thinks this is going to be frontline troops. Is that possible if the US backs them?
Well, there's a lot that we're kidding ourselves about. That you have people saying, "Oh, for goodness' sake, isn't it terrible? We have a prospect of British military commitment to Ukraine. Isn't it a terrible thing? And would boots go on the ground?" And this is the thing where Macron and Merz have been particularly good. And indeed, watch out. I think there are 2 other players that are proving increasingly vital. And they're very skilled negotiators, not in our very rather grungy Anglo-Saxon way, but one is Giorgia Meloni. Giorgia Meloni can get both Trump and Putin to listen to her. And she's very shrewd, very sharp. She's a street fighter. She's very good. And the other is President Stubb of Finland, the golfing partner of Trump. He really did a job on him, and that was pretty terrific. But the idea that we haven't had a British military presence, I have to be very careful now, because there is stuff that I know, and it's quite confidential. We've done an awful lot on the ground. A lot of it has been quality as much as quantity, but the advisors, logistics, the planners, it's been pretty good. And that end of it has impressed the Ukrainians. But what they're worried about, because they've experienced British training, and British training, platoon commander level, company commander level, they say for the kind of fighting that they're facing in reality is much too cautious, much too risk averse. I think that's where I think the government, successive governments, and I held no candle to one particular party or the other, I think they've been both as bad as each other, Sunak or Starmer. I don't think they've got a clue about the grey zone, on-off war, confrontation, escalation, de-escalation process that we're now in, despite it being explained to them by the authors of the Defence Review, because George Robertson, Richard Barrons, Fiona Hill were absolutely clear. In modern terms, we are in a near state of war with Russia, and that isn't going away. The Starmer government, including the Secretary of Defence, refused to accept that. And it's a problem for us. Yeah.
And in terms of how Russia are reading this, we talk about the threat from Russia. Like you say, this slightly confused message coming out of the US, there must be some heads in Russia that are spinning, having gone in on Friday thinking they were being given all of this land for nothing, and now hearing hearing Trump talking about NATO soldiers being involved in on the ground assistance to Ukraine. I mean, how are the Russians going to be reading that?
I think they've gamed it. I think they've gamed it already. because that's why they came out, wham, bam, thank you, ma'am, on the bus. That was it. And I think because it's very cunning what they're doing, that they're having difficulty. It's not insuperable because it's build up after build up after build up. They're recruiting 9,000 more than they're losing a month at the moment. And they do things by numbers. Not that they're ignoring the lessons of modern warfare, because in terms of electronic warfare, jamming of drones, they've been very effective. And that's very worried. And the new, more powerful drones based on the Iranian Shahed 136, which they're making themselves, that is changing things quite a bit, but they're not nearly as effective as they should be, given their superiority in numbers. No, it was a bit of a wheeze, frankly, to use the parlance of that master tactician, Dennis the Menace. Dennis the Menace would say, "Let's give this a whirl. Let's." And what that if they could have duped Witkoff and Trump into saying, "Get them to give up Donetsk," because that's the tough one. And Zelensky is militarily savvy enough that is the cornerstone of the defense, almost like the old quadrilateral in the grand wars in Europe, Napoleonic wars, the First World War, and so on. It's very, very well laid, and they want to crack that. And if it was a gimme, if they could, so much we win. But that's probably going a bit too far. And I think that Putin went to Alaska last weekend, knowing full well he wasn't going to stop the war.
So there has been some sort of reaction, though, out of the Kremlin. Again today, we've heard the Russians saying we're not going to allow European troops onto Ukrainian soil. That's a no-go for us. And we've also heard Russia has lowered the nuclear threshold again. So how do we read into those messages from Russia?
If they have further equipment failures, and they're on an up at the moment, but really their record on armour, for example, tanks, I mean, has been absolutely dreadful. I mean, they've gone through so many. They're not building enough new ones in time. Supposing the war, the tide could be turned, and it's amazing that Ukraine has held out so long. But for instance, I think the Germans, the bite is on the Germans to use the Taurus, to allow them to use the Taurus missile. That's a depth weapon which can get the drone factories. It's as simple as that. And I think that the Ukrainians are smart enough to realize if they're not going to give it to us, we'd better build our own. And I'm sure that's what's going on at the moment. I think there was never any question of Russia giving any permis, any allowance to NATO forces going into Ukraine. But this is what I fear. You've got to keep balancing the local, the tactical, the battlefield narrative of what's going on, and the wider operation and the wider strategic aim and view of Putin. And that's when we get into fantasy land. But fantasies, as we've learned with Hitler, Napoleon, and God knows how Julius Caesar, can have a reality. It's make Russia again. The biggest betrayal of the 20th century for Putin and his gang. And look how many of his old KGB colleagues are in there with him, particularly the two chiefs of the FSB and the Foreign Intelligence Service. It's let's get back that position of power and influence, break out of the old myth of encirclement. And I wonder whether, and this comes to a nuclear point, they are considering taking on NATO. And that's where they're developing a new generation of tactical weapons forward deployed into Belarus, which gives you an overlook into the Baltic and into Ukraine. And I think that that's where we're in a moment of acute danger, because they're being way, way too casual about nuclear deterrence. They said, yeah, maybe they've blown every other nuclear arms reduction agreement, including New START. New START is due to resume next year, and they've not given, sorry, pardon the pun, a start date for it. So what are they messing about with there? And I think that this is in the back of Putin's rather desperate mind, is that, that if I can't get my way, then I'll do it by some of the toughest means available. I don't think it would be a strategic nuclear war, because he doesn't want a war with the United States. He wants to humiliate Europe, though. Absolutely clear. And that's why, because he's fascinated, obsessed by London, the UK, Churchill's influence with Stalin, and he's obsessed with the royal family, for example. And that's why I think we're having such sustained asymmetric attacks. One very serious cyber attack per day, either remotely or directly connected to Russian bad actors. So that's the position that we're in. My editors, half the government, absolutely hate me talking this way, but let's get real. It's realistic. And what worries me about Western planning, and I think Macron really spots this above all of them, is that we should be planning for what we need to do right now. Don't announce these big plans down the road. France, another nuclear power, like Britain, has a very ambitious defense program, but like Britain is absolutely strapped for the money to do it. Merz is ramping up defense and defense expenditure in Germany. Not that quickly at all. Taking 2 to 3 years, which is music to Putin's ears. And then Maloney saying, let's get in, let's exploit their weakness. Oil and gas, we need their oil and gas. Italy desperately needs it. Let's work that. Let's work him at his own game. And by the way, in terms of expenditure and preparation, of all the large powers in Europe, although it's a more modest order of battle, it's a modern one in Italy, and they have been exemplary compared to the UK in how to spend and how to run out a proper defence equipment and procurement budget and programme. And so, I was on a certain channel, not known for me exactly left wing, yesterday, and they were sneering at Maloney and these so-called experts, two knights and a lord, or two lords and a knight, I'm not quite sure, were having a good sneerogram, and it was clueless. It was absolutely so difficult. And I'm afraid make Britain great again, isolated Britain, Britain first, ain't going to work.
Well, I want to come back to that nuclear point there, Robert. I mean, how far out of control could this get if Trump either half-bakes these agreements with Europe, Russia and Ukraine, agrees one thing to Europe, one thing to Ukraine and one thing to Russia, and those three agreements just don't click, or even worse, if no agreement is reached, it just, the bottom falls out of these talks that have been going on for the last week almost now. Where does that leave us on the world stage, and where does that leave Trump?
Well, I think, first of all, the synergy between Paris and London is going to be very, very important. The discipline in the Ministry of Defence, going back to the great thinkers about nuclear deterrent, and they thought very, very deeply about it, and had a very moral position. I mean, people like Sir Michael Quinlan, aided from the outside by the most brilliant, practical military historian we've seen in 50 years, Sir Michael Howard, and they brought through people in the Ministry of Defence like Sir Kevin Tebbit, now reserve. They knew about the whole business of forewarning, tripwires, targeting, and what you need to do and what you must not do, and what you do about cutouts. This is where, for instance, when now Field Marshal Lord Guthrie was Chief of the Defence Staff and previously Chief of the General Staff, he was very, very good at defusing the tension between Pakistan and India when Pakistan became nuclear. It's that kind of deep, detailed thought, and it's actually where the commentariat, nuclear's a bad thing or a good thing, and you can read it in, the commentary pages of even our own dear paper, The Times, that this is granular, this is hard work. And you really have to keep it day after day. And you can't have people just polishing their credentials saying, I brought peace to Northern Ireland with Tony Blair, no names, no pack drill. But that is not what we're looking at now. We're looking at a highly complex, difficult position, flex point, And unlike the Cold War, we've got a fragmented public opinion behind these different countries. You look at the opinion polls, even on Ukraine, not at all the way either the total isolationists, the more, should I say, the Hegseth, Tucker Carlson wing would go. It's much more complex and much more nuanced. And the people of the world, the women and men of the world, understand that the world's an extremely complicated place. And despite tariffs, despite the new mercantilism of Trump and the like, the global economy ain't dead yet. And we have a global economy, not just in finance and commerce, but we do have it in political theory and political economy as well. And that's the point. And, you know, Louis, we're coming to the end, I think, now, but we've got to mention the person we haven't mentioned, Xi Jinping.
Mm-hmm. Well, that is exactly what I was going to come on to, actually, Robert. Just finally on that. I mean, what is the role of China? But just finally on that nuclear point, I just feel I should push back a little and just ask, you know, should we really take it that seriously, the nuclear threat from Putin? I mean, do you really think he would go for a tactical nuclear option, given the pressure from China, the idea of mutually assured destruction, and if nothing else, self-preservation of, if not Russia, the territory in Ukraine that Putin claims is Russian? Will none of that stop Putin from going for a tactical nuclear option?
Clanism, gangster politics. There's Putin, but there's Shoigu. There's the Chechen leadership, which is in a spin at the moment, say, let's have a go at it. This was the real danger of somebody like Prigozhin, and Shoigu and he were in a toe-to-toe. This is the thing, that what happens if the chain of command and discipline breaks down? I think, interestingly, one of the toughs who's now not looking quite so tough because he's so worried about it is Lukashenko in Belarus, because he has changed. He knows he's just Putin's patsy. He's under a virtual occupation, annexation. The idea of Belarus independence is, you know, something that barely covers the Moscow Times these days, let alone Pravda and the rest of it. Perhaps I've got that the wrong way round, but you know what I mean. It's very, very interesting. What I'm worried about too is how well Putin is managing in commanding the narrative. It's very, very disciplined in the information control in Russia. And as long as you keep on at it, it gets picked up in the West. It's going to be very interesting. I think Starmer's got some big decisions to make, along with Macron and Merz, but it's particularly Starmer. And he's got to make up his mind before politics comes back from the holidays with the party conferences and the new parliament and the budget. And he's got to get his team, and they're not strong. We've had them now for 14 months. By that I mean Lamy, Healy, and Jonathan Powell. He's got to concentrate on the crisis in hand now. It is a crisis, and the solutions cannot be kicked down the road for another 2 or 3 years, which is all their major policy pronouncements seem to be looking at, namely the defence review again, the national security strategy. We haven't had a defence industrial strategy. We haven't had an equipment budget appraisal and an equipment programme issued for over a year or 18 months now. They got to do it. And above all, they've got to deal with recruiting and retention in the armed forces. Otherwise, we'll have nothing to play with within 5 years.
And China's view of all of this, the talks that are going on at the moment, Putin's thoughts on maybe getting that bit of land he's been fighting over for so long?
China is a whole different subject, because there is something quite clearly going on which we don't understand. Xi has been remarkably silent over the past 2 or 3 weeks. There are all sorts of awful aspersions being made, particularly about the property bubble, yet again, the employment situation, the belief that they have been concealing how rapidly demographic wintering, aging is setting in, and also the true statistics on COVID, much more extravagant. And so there does seem to be something up. He is quite clearly trying to read the lessons from the turmoil in Eastern Europe for what he can do in the East and South China Seas with Taiwan. And he will, with Trump being the way things are at the moment, try to work out whether he can do something on Taiwan without doing it militarily, which they don't really want to do because it's so risky. Now, come back in, yes, his support for Russia, it's absolutely vital. Because if you read the OA, the operational analysis, the INT on, I mentioned the Shahed 136, now the gun twos made by Russia. The vital electronic bits and pieces are all Chinese, or largely 80-90%, according to one report. And that's where we are there. And he can say stop, or you want to go on. And if the Europeans get fed up, they could cause him real embarrassment where he doesn't want to be called real embarrassment, because in a way, the European market is not far behind the American market in being so important to him. Supposing they shut off, it's a big supposing, the Europort of Rotterdam to China, where it has, in terms of investments and assets, they have about 40% of a lot of the heavy industrial installations. By that, I mean the petrochemical storage and other facilities there. But if they said, slam, we're going to boycott now, I wonder what would happen. It's really quite volatile. And what I hope I'm done for the listeners, and you, Louis, I hope I've raised a hell of a lot of questions, because I am not omniscient. Now, that's very pompous to say that. These are real questions that I really want to know the answer for. I really want to know what happened in Alaska. I'm less interested in what happened in Washington, but in Alaska, judging by the demeanor of Levitt and Rubio and the others, they got a hell of a shock.
Well, Robert Fox, as you say, many questions that you've given us there, but I'm sure just as many answers for our audience as well. Robert Fox, defence editor at The Standard, contributor to the iPaper and the Observer, and of course The Times. Thank you very much for joining me today on the Trump Report.